often the classroom labels them as difficult. The boardroom calls them as visionaries. What might look like chaos from the outside may well be genius in motion. So you're not broken, just misunderstood. Another internal negative dialogue is that I need fixing somehow. I need someone to do something to me in order for me to realize my potential.
What if the traits we're told to fix are the very things that make great leaders? In this episode, a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Ali Ajaz, helps us rethink neurodivergence. We talk myths, decision-making, identity, and what happens when we stop trying to normalize and start empowering young people to lead as they are. It's not about fixing, it's about seeing differently. You're listening and watching the Haroon Rabbani podcast. Welcome back, Dr. Ali Ajaz.
Hi, Haroon. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure as always.
From your lens as a psychiatrist, what are the most common myths about neurodivergence and leadership potential?
Well, there's many myths. We can talk about some of the top ones. So I guess the first one is that neurodivergence always has to equal dysfunction. And that's just not true. If you're on the neurodivergent spectrum, you're more likely to have some level of dysfunction, maybe more so than the average person. I think that's balanced out by skills and abilities that the average person doesn't have either. So it's not seeing all things in a negative light. Many believe that ADHD, autism is just purely disabling, when in reality, the traits that people with ADHD and autism have can offer novel insights, creative solutions, and resilience. It just needs a bit more nurturing than, say, someone who isn't on the neurodivergent umbrella. The second thing is that leadership requires emotional uniformity, so that it takes away people who are neurodivergent, who can struggle more with the intensity of emotional regulation. Emotional executive dysfunction is a core trait of people with autism, people with ADHD. However, it doesn't preclude them from being effective leaders. And in fact, having levels of emotional intensity, authenticity can often drive passion and be inspiring and motivating more than just someone who's calm and linear all the time. And I guess the third big myth is that only kind of fixed people can lead. You can't have flaws as a leader, which is just so not true, because we know that the only way to learn is by making mistakes. That's how anyone learns. How do we know what a learning experience is if we haven't made a mistake and learned from it? We don't learn from our victories or successes as much. It's really through our failures. So having environments and cultures that allow a safe space for people to learn through failure, which is the only form of learning really, and not focusing on whether someone is neurodivergent and say, oh, well, you failed because you've got autism or you've got ADHD. And it's really changing the way that we see what effective leadership and what it takes to become an effective leader is.
I'm really glad you said that, because one of my mantras for my young leaders, the ones who are up and coming through my young leaders nexus, is I actually say to them, I want you to have micro failures on a daily basis. And if any project, no matter how big it is, if you're not having these micro failures as you're going along, then I'm not doing my job properly, and neither are you. So I'm totally up for that. So how does such a brain process decision making or risk differently? And how can there be an advantage as a leader?
Well, I would say neurodivergent leaders don't avoid risk, they translate it into momentum. So often we live our lives looking for security and safety. And in the workspace, that often gets translated into making safe decisions. And often safe decisions don't translate into giving the biggest rewards. So you have to take risk in order to get more reward. And neurodiverse individuals are much more equipped to take risks in a way that you could get the potential benefits in growing a company, growing a business. And people with ADHD brains, for example, often seek novelty and challenge. And this can lead to rapid decision-making and bold risk-taking, not being reckless, but taking risks in a way that can lead to valuable innovation, or in particular, crisis leadership. So one of the things that we associate with ADHD is dopamine-seeking behaviors. And often people think that they're kind of pleasant thrill-seeking behaviors. That's true, but also fear and danger can also promote dopamine in people's brains. So often people with ADHD are the calmest person in the room when it comes to a crisis. That's the person you want in charge, not someone who's going to be affected by the dangers in a way that shy away from that. You want someone who has ADHD to be the leader in a crisis because they're more likely to be thinking calmer and more focused because of the impact of the dopamine and the way the brain is wired. Another way that we can see that neurodivergent brains process things in a more helpful way is that less likely to conform. Autistic or dyslexic leaders aren't influenced by groupthink and more shielded from that because they're more focused in what is more important for them to thrive and to excel. And if you're a leader, then it's you and your team by extension. So this allows for more independent, more ethical choices, especially under pressure. And the third area is the creativity, and we see this over and over again. The dysregulated, or what can be perceived as dysregulated, but non-linear processing often leads to pattern recognition that other people miss completely. And this gives a cognitive edge, especially in uncertain environments. And this translates into creative problem solving in a way that people who aren't neurodivergent often struggle with.
We hear ADHD, autism, dyslexia talked about mostly in schools, actually. What happens when these young people become leaders?
Well, often the classroom labels them as difficult. The boardroom calls them as visionaries. And we see the evolution and the unmasking in a way that unrealized strengths can surface. So hyperfocus, systematic thinking, and intuition can emerge as core leadership assets, where in the educational environment, things are so rigid that these things aren't encouraged. So we've established that people who are divergent are less likely to conform. Education systems all about conformity, realize the strengths, but in a more flexible, in a more creative environment, these strengths can surface in a way that just hasn't been realized before. But the other side to that is that the masking that children often show in the education environment can translate into burnout. So if not supported in an adequate way, the camouflaging that they have to work harder or perceive to work harder in order to achieve the same or more as other people can often lead to fatigue, identity confusion, and a decline in overall mental health, anxiety, depression, insomnia, sleep problems. So support needs to be there as much as they can excel in the workspace. They're not supported in the right way. They're much more likely to go and tilt towards the burnout. It is a fine balance.
So traits that are often seen as problems like impulsivity or hyperfocus, how can these actually become tools for innovation and action? Obviously, you and I know the answers for our audience.
Well, it's really interesting. It's all about framing and perception. So what might look like chaos from the outside may well be genius in motion. So framing and how we frame and understand words and behaviors is really important. So we talk about impulsivity. Now, impulsivity, it's a vague concept, it's very general. It could mean something negative, or it could mean something really positive. So impulsivity in the workspace with neurodivergent leaders, I would see as speed of action. In fast moving environments, impulsive leaders can make decisive moves, leap into unknowns, and execute ideas before other people are ready. And this can be a really positive trait. Hyperfocus is also something that often is given a negative connotation. I don't know why, but we can just see that as deep work. So neurodivergent leaders can lock into creative or analytical work for hours and generate breakthroughs. And I would argue it's difficult to generate breakthroughs without putting all that effort in. It just doesn't come just like that. The other thing that often is get banded around is distractibility. I think being sensitive to low-level stimuli, allowing the brain to work in different ways leads to innovation and ideas. And I think connecting unrelated ideas is often the root of innovation. I think this is how we define it. So someone might be perceived to be as being distractible when actually they're working on innovation. So framing is really important. And unfortunately, there's too many negative connotations with the terminology that we use with neurodiverse individuals. And I think it is time to change that and to challenge that.
I find it interesting that as I'm getting older, particularly with a brain that's certainly got ADHD, the whole thing about joining up patterns and distractibility, I'm not distracted by distractions, but I see connections and ability to do that. It's actually getting stronger. So I'm like more, in my mind anyway, I think I'm more innovative. What are your thoughts? Can we actually develop that as we get older, or is this something that stays the same throughout our lives?
I think potential is always there, whether you can access it and tap into it. And generally what happens, and I think what certainly happened with yourself, is your ability to learn from experience, to reflect, and to actually understand yourself and to be more comfortable with yourself and who you are versus who you were 20 years ago, for example. And part of that is maturation, yes, but also understanding and wisdom that happens with age. So the more you're able to understand and therefore accept yourself, the less anxiety and tension there is clouding all that potential that's there. It's often our own uncertainties that stop us from realizing our own potential, our own fears. When you allow that to disperse and to be able to care a bit less about it, you're able to tap into aspects of your potential that you're not able to without that work. It just doesn't happen by itself.
That's more profound than most people can understand what you just said. And we won't go into the profundity of it because it's like my brain will take us in a different direction, of course. And so that being the case, putting that aside, so tell me about what does emotional regulation look like for a neurodivergent individual in a high pressure leadership setting?
So it often looks like emotional intensity. It's often seen as a flaw that someone is really intense. But I consider it more as a leadership engine that needs tuning, not taming. And often the intensity that people show, that neurodivergent leaders show, is very inspiring. And that's the first thing. You need to be able to inspire the people under you, people that follow you, along with that and being inspirational. Charisma is also there as well. So these are really strong, positive traits that you can't necessarily buy or learn from a book. And so you're either charismatic and passionate. You can't just fake it. You just really can't fake it because people figure it out. So these things often feed into this intensity. And I would consider it as a kind of passion and urgency, but it does need to be managed through self-awareness and co-regulation. So not only can that individual sustain the role that they're doing, because left unchecked, the intensity can push them closer towards a burnout, but developing more emotional insights through coaching, structured support, CBT, did the whole podcast on CBT, having routines, and being able to manage yourself outside of the workspace. They are really kind of key traits to have in order to help regulate that emotional aspect in the workspace. So I see it as a strength if tuned, but if left untamed, can lead to a vulnerability, which can spiral at times and have negative unintended effects.
Can you share any patterns you've noticed in successful leaders who are neurodivergent, people who, whether they're formally diagnosed or not?
I can think of one example, a very brilliant young chap, and he was studying at university. So this was before he got into his leadership role. And I remember him telling me about just the way that his brain was working. So very bright chap doing mathematics, physics degree. And he said, Dr. Ali, the way my brain works, I just don't understand it. I'm able to do these complex calculations, but my mind has to be thinking about something else, something unrelated. And in the background, it's doing what it needs to do. And then by the end of it, I've got all the answers. And that just blew me away. People with neurodivergent minds, I think probably have like 2 or 3 brains in one, that they're able to work in layers that other people can't. That really took me back and helped my understanding to try and figure out what makes neurodivergent minds more special. And I think it's this multi-level processing that we don't talk enough about. People who lead with neurodivergent abilities often rewrite rules. They're obsessive about purpose, and they're just built differently. And I think these are core ingredients that allow a business to not only develop and evolve, also to be able to create something out of nothing. And a lot of neurodivergent individuals are working in their own startups, have developed their own businesses, because it allows them to create an environment that works for them. The flexibility is not about not having accountability. It's about the flexibility that most workspaces don't give people with neurodivergent minds. And that's a real challenge because they don't fit into boxes in a conventional way. You need to allow flexibility, which is often frowned upon, but also technically can be quite difficult. You might be seeing kind of favoring the workspaces, traditional workspaces just don't know how to deal with that, don't know how to be flexible enough for individuals that need it. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge in businesses and leadership moving forward. Now, how flexible can you be? Where's the balance between that and doing not enough versus doing too much and affecting morale in the wider team?
You're watching the Haroon Rapani podcast with myself, Haroon Rapani, and with Dr. Ali Ajaz. Ali, one of the things that really drive me up the wall is labels when people, it could be positive or negative, by the way. Negative, definitely. And even the positive, I just don't like labels, but I'm not normal. How do labels like disorder or deficit shape a young person's identity, especially when they have leadership potential?
I think it's devastating. So I work with hundreds and hundreds of adults with ADHD, autism. And one thing very clear is that they all have high levels of anxiety. They all suffer from mood problems. And the one thing they share in common with all those things is no self-esteem. So it doesn't matter what they're achieving on the outside. On the inside, very damaged by comments on before. So in our formative years, they're called formative years because they help us form and shape our self-identity. Really crucial. We were looking up to in the early 20s, all the things that happen at school, college, our home during that time. And if you're labeled as a naughty child, as a class clown, as the one who's just away with the fairies, these things stick. These things are so powerful and they might seem benign, but they're not at all. And they help shape a sense of belonging or lack of in the wider world. And this stays with an individual. These labels can be very damaging on one hand. On the other hand, what we also know is that if, for example, we look at ADHD, someone gets diagnosed with ADHD, if that is, in fact, that they suffer from that and get treatment for it, their trajectory in life improves. So they're more likely to get a better job. They're more likely to have a better education. They're more likely to be healthy and ultimately live longer. It's a devastating impact of undiagnosed ADHD, for example. So it is a balance. The D in ADHD is disorder. We can't change that. But it's getting the balance between recognizing something, giving the right support and treatment where needed. But I don't think everyone with neurodivergent traits, ADHD traits, needs a label or treatment in that way. Some people do. What I'm noticing more and more are parents reaching out to me, are children in their late teens, early 20s, that finding it difficult to progress in life. And when I read through the information they provide me, it's clear they're on the neurodivergent spectrum, but they don't have, probably not enough to get a diagnosis. So they're in this gray space. Parents don't know how to manage this. Schools don't know how to manage. And that there's a growing population, a subgroup that we have of neurodivergent individuals. We're not talking about clinical diagnosis here, that are being failed because there's a lack of education, there's a lack of support, and parents are just stuck. And then they end up reaching out to someone like me because they're desperate. It is a damning state of affairs. And this group is only going to increase. And we've seen the trajectory of this over the last 10, 20 years, and it's going to increase. So the work that you do in trying to raise awareness around this and to try and push the boundaries to make that cultural shift in how we support our youth is so crucial. It's either now or never. We have to take action around this.
100%. So what kind of internal narrative do neurodivergent young people need to write to see themselves as capable leaders, even if it's not leaders of an organization, but leaders within themselves, for themselves?
You have to be the leader in yourself before you can lead other people. You're absolutely right. So I would say from a common internal trope is broken. And I would reframe that to say brilliance in disguise. So people can't see what's hidden, and it's only down to you to be able to express that. So you're not broken, just misunderstood. Another internal negative dialogue is that I need fixing somehow. I need someone to do something to me in order for me to realize my potential. Where actually the locus of control is within yourself, even though it doesn't feel like that. And that you're just different in a world that doesn't fully understand you. But your power is still there. Everyone has a power and the potential. So it's reclaiming that locus of control. And we know that countless studies and from my own clinical experience, when you shift external locus of control to internal, that empowers you more than anything. And that's really been a big part of my clinical approach over the years, and the successes that I've had with individuals is helping them reclaim that locus of control in their life from external to internal. And that's the most powerful thing that I think anyone can achieve. And I guess just being told that someone's bad, I'm bad at the rules. In fact, actually, the rules need changing, and there's no one better placed to change the rules than you. And it's often the leaders, neurodivergent leaders, are able to make rules and to push boundaries and to make those gains in a way that other people can't.
I think a lot of organizations don't realize that there's huge hidden talent within their teams. They're not being realized simply because they're not creating the conditions for them to be realized. So what kind of work environments helps neurodiverse leaders, future leaders, thrive? What shuts them down?
We touched on this slightly earlier, the relative autonomy and flexibility. So rather than being very prescriptive around how someone does something, actually saying, well, this is what we need, and this is when we need it by, and the rest is up to you. Actually, how we would like to be treated in the work environment as a grown adult, just being given the responsibility. And neurodivergent individuals don't shy away from responsibility. I would argue they take and value responsibility more than the average person. So giving them the autonomy and flexibility, they're allowed to thrive. And that doesn't necessarily need to look so different from the outside. You're giving someone a task and a project, but you're not micromanaging them. They can't be told what to do, not in a stubborn way, not in a difficult way. But I would argue no one really likes being told what to do unless you don't know what to do. And that's just magnified. People who are neurodivergent aren't aliens compared to people who aren't. It's just exaggeration of traits that we see in everyone. So that's why we hear silly comments like, oh, well, everyone's a bit autistic-y, or everyone's a bit ADHD. Does it really exist? Because I'm a bit forgetful and sometimes I don't want to get out of bed. Yeah, we're not talking about alien beings here. I see things on a spectrum, human behavior on a spectrum. And people with neurodivergence have certain traits are exaggerated, positive traits exaggerated, but also negative traits exaggerated equally and oppositely. And that's the thing. It's not about being Superman who has all these positive traits of what human beings are capable of, but without anything of the negative. The reality is that as brilliant as neurodivergent individuals are, the closer to vulnerability they are also. And that's the thing that needs to get managed, not their brilliance.
Oh my God, I wish people were aware of this kind of stuff, because I'll just say, I mean, I've been divorced for a very long time, and I've got two sons from my marriage, and the communication has been actually, for me, devastating, because it's always been, you need to do this and you need to do that, despite explaining. If you talk to a child, they understand. But then you're not just talking to an adult, you're talking to somebody who's got ADHD, and that just winds them up or shuts them down, and often both. This is so important, and it's so easy to gloss over, so easy to gloss over. Let's take somebody who is neurodiverse, whatever the particular diagnosis or non-diagnosis is. What kind of mentorship or psychological support is most helpful for them? And as they develop, as they step into adulthood.
So I would say that the first thing is around giving people frameworks. So frameworks to help A, manage themselves, and B, manage the world around them. So we're looking at day to day. How can you make the most out of your day to day? And then how does that translate into the external world? And so it's not about structures per se, but we need frameworks and scaffolding. Again, it's kind of changing the terminology, structure and routine, because these things, when you use these terms, people are neurodivergent, it's like sunlight to vampires. It's like, this is not what I want to hear. But it's actually scaffolding and giving the right level of support at the right time. That has to start from day to day, because the dysregulation is very real. So you can have a leader on one hand, which is excelling and has developed a business out of an idea, but they perhaps struggle to get up in the morning. They struggle to unwind at night. They struggle to have time to invest in their brain health. And that's so fundamental. Understanding what you need to do is one thing. Understanding how you need to do it is another thing. And I think that's really the first step of meaningful engagement and meaningful support for an individual neurodivergent leader. Manage your internal world. And then it's navigating the challenges in someone's individual workspace. Often, once they're able to navigate the internal world, the external world becomes much easier.
So what do you think the world loses when we try to normalize neurodivergent minds instead of empowering them to lead as they are?
Well, we lose innovation, we lose imagination, and we lose the passion. I think these are key for any progression in any civilization to take place. And let's get this right. We don't need everyone to be neurodivergent, because we need people doing the safe stuff, the reliable stuff. Give the foundations and platforms for people who are neurodivergent to thrive and to push through boundaries. And many of the world's greatest breakthroughs, from art to science, have come through neurodivergent minds. We look at Van Gogh, through artistic expression. I think he created around 2,000 pieces of work in 10 years. The passion and dedication and commitment that's required, that's superhuman. And they weren't stick drawings, right? So we also have Mary Temple Grandin, who is an autistic professional, changed the way of farming and animal behavior and how we manage animals in an agricultural setting. Just completely changed the way we approach that and how we understand animals. And it was through her neurodivergent brilliance that she was able to lead the way on this, and she's a leading authority on this. Wherever we look, neurodivergent people are innovating and pushing. but that's on the platform provided by everyone else. So it's about valuing everyone's strength in society. But if we don't embrace individuals like that, then we lose the innovation, we lose the imagination and creativity in our society. And I think ultimately the world will stagnate because we live in a dynamic universe. Things are either progressing or regressing.
If someone has either got neurodivergent, we're talking about an adult, of course, children with those conditions, how do they get hold of you for advice and guidance?
So I have a website, www.draliajaz.co.uk, so people can drop me a message through there. Also on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Ali Ajaz, and people can message me on there. And I get lots of inquiries every day and do my best. I do get back to everyone eventually, but that's probably the best way to reach out to me.
For client work, you presumably it's primarily London Canary Wharf office.
Yes, I also work online, so that allows me to work with people from out the country and internationally. So pretty flexible. Theme of today, needing to be flexible, and that's what I aim to do.
So one of the things I've always been fascinated about is how do you take an individual? And initially was thinking about myself, so this actually, how can I make a difference to the world? How can I change the world? Because I saw a lot of horrible things go on in the world. And as time progressed, I learned so much on human excellence, coach, mentor, trained people, spoke all over the world. And here's what I've found is many of the extraordinarily talented people like Isaac, and I like a couple of the people mentioned, like people like Alan Turing, all of them, significant portion of them, I should say, I wouldn't say all of them, have got some kind of neurodiverse condition. And so I ended up setting up a series of interviewing not Isaac Newton because he kept, ignoring my emails, but people who are alive. And turns out, significant portion of them have got neurodiverse conditions. The reason I mention why I'm writing Raising Titans is because you, the listener, the viewer, if you have those conditions, or if you have people around you who have those conditions, actually count yourself lucky and blessed and the world a better place if they're allowed to step into their natural state of being. Because the world, the system is not set up for that. But if we could honor people for who they are, as they are, it can, and I believe it will change the world. Ali, is there any final comments you want to make before we wrap this episode up?
Yes, I would say the biggest thing is to be able to give belief in someone. And that's the biggest gift that you can give anyone, in particular people with neurodivergency. And I've seen this over and over again. There's no magic wand that can change things. But it's when we talk about that internal locus of control, it's actually belief in someone. And working with lots of people on the neurodivergent spectrum, belief is probably the most powerful medication, most powerful intervention, most powerful gift I can give to someone, is to genuinely and authentically believe in someone's ability and to convey that in a way that they can help internalize. That really sets people free.
Thank you ever so much, Ali. You've been watching and listening to the Haroon Rabbani podcast with myself, Haroon Rabbani, and Dr. Ali Ajaz. Make sure you tune in for the next episode. See you next time. Bye for now.